Oracle of the Forgotten. The Humans. Rise Before the Fall, Part 1. The redhead had been through quite a bit before this nightmare woke her. Another death, this one without context, just an extremely bright light. She decided her only option was to practice for a while with her blade. When she couldn't sleep, it was one of the few things that would relax her. Aylin had a lot on her mind. She'd only just found her family and her village. She'd just learned of her heritage. Still, it felt odd. Her parents had blue hair and blue eyes, nothing like how she looked at the moment. Her golden eyes were bad enough, but the red hair was a stark difference from anyone in the community at all. They referred to this as a curse by an outsider that they were working on fixing when she'd been abducted. As she spun to strike at an invisible foe, she remembered how she'd learned about this village. She was a Veilseen guard, a tribal woman who wandered from place to place capturing and domesticating humans, demons, and other entities as they went along their paths. When she was younger, she hadn't understood that was slave trading, but as she grew older, she began to feel trapped within their ranks. Those who attempted to leave were often hunted down and killed. Not wanting the same fate, she'd been biding her time. It was in Gluttony's realm she finally made a decision. She was planning her exit. Up to this point, they'd always taken ones who were old enough to stand and fight on their own. Even the children were over a certain age. The Veilseen had raided a small village near a forest. Above could be seen a series of large mountains drifting off into the distance and becoming more ice-covered the further away they were. The village had many women and children, but seemed short on men. They had an easy enough time taking most of the population prisoner and began sorting them out by gender, willingness to fight, and apparent ability. She'd ignored most of this until seeing a boy with strangely colored hair. Everyone else had darker hair, but this small child's hair was white. In fact, he was quite a bit smaller than some of the others, barely able to walk at the time, and she'd been commanded to carry him to the carts for the small or injured. She knew they were going to sell the children. She demanded to know who the buyer was. Over the next day or two, she managed to convince their leaders to sell this group of children to a human merchant who traded slaves between the realms. It was better than what they'd planned, and the man seemed eager to have the group. She lost track of time planning her escape, but they'd spent several years in the realms of Gluttony. She had been increasingly aware of the tension between herself and their leader. If nothing else, she had been overly outspoken about the changes, especially capturing even the smallest of children. One day, she just had enough. The village they'd raided was to gather sacrifices for something called the Great Awakening. This was another village filled with women and small children. According to the women, their men had been killed in a ritual slaughter only weeks before to appease one of the gods. The Veilseen leader had them take the pregnant and nursing mothers. Again, something that had once been sacred to their people. They were meant to be left unharmed. This was something that they never would have done before. Aylin could stand no more of it. She took up her blade to challenge their leader and all of these changes. After a fierce battle, many of the Veilseen had fallen. Aylin rested her blade against the throat of their leader and forged a deal. They would leave her to go in peace and return to the old ways, or she would return and hunt the women all to their deaths. With that agreed to, she departed to speak with the Lord of the Lands. Over her years with these people, she'd learned a lot about her own history. She wanted to find this land called Astoria and a village named Arkite, where she heard she'd been captured from during a raid. This was in the human realms, which meant she needed passage from this land to that one. The first time she went to see Gluttony, she refused his offer. It didn't matter to her. Time in the Dark Realms was different than the human ones. Her family there may or may not know how many years had passed for her. She was certain it had been far less for them. It took her a while to arrange a deal with Gluttony. She eventually worked something out, and he opened a portal for her to travel to the realms of mortals. Time passing differently was a part of the problem. She ran into a young man who was on his way to find the Dark Realms himself. For a short time they became very close. The woman had hoped to stay longer, but an injury in battle against an angel nearly killed her, and fear kicked in. Aelin had been told that those closest to her would die horribly if they learned about her curse. She realized that she'd already begun to fall in love with him when she chose to leave. She was already thought dead, her corpse dragged off by one of the enemy. This had left her transformed into the blue-haired girl, a change she feared he might not understand. Others who had not died immediately always rejected her change as too difficult to understand or perhaps even dangerous. She was thought to be dead. She hoped if he felt that way they could both move on. She decided the best she could do is to continue to Arkite and try to forget him altogether. Perhaps it was a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts. Not much after entering the human realms, she was killed during a raid. While defending a village against the raiders, she'd lured them to a high mountain bridge nearby. She never fully remembered this battle clearly. She felt the rocks collapsing beneath her feet. She managed to fight off nearly all of the raiders. One had a badly injured young lady that he was holding hostage. Aelin hoped to rescue this woman, but had not counted on the girl siding with the one who attacked her village. The woman pushed her back, and as the blue-haired girl felt the rocks slide beneath her feet again, she grabbed onto the other two, hoping to take them with her. All three tumbled to the ground, each with varied fatal injuries. Her own left her body badly broken. Locked into the pain and unable to move from the physical damage, she was trapped within her own mind for a time. She was still not fully dead, and she could feel her memories pulling away from her own mind. The last thought she recalled was wondering how she'd gotten to where she was lying. When she woke, she could hardly remember the previous few years, but still clearly recalled that she was going to look for a specific city. Once again the redhead, Aelin spent the next few years trying to find Arkite. When she finally arrived, she was greeted at first with suspicion, then taken before the leaders of the land. The king and queen seemed more than eager to greet her. In the short time there, memories of a happier childhood began to come to her mind. A part of her wanted to cling to them. She could remember how kind they'd been before her disappearance. Seeing the flame-shaped tattoos along the entire left side of her body, they declared she was definitely their lost child, and brought her into the kingdom with a full welcome, and later a party for her return. At first, she'd suspected nothing, but only a few weeks after her arrival she began to have disturbing dreams. Before that, she'd been allowed to explore and enjoy the area to her heart's content. The day the dreams began, she was told that she needed to stay within the castle grounds. They had heard rumors that there were hunters looking for her. She figured maybe this was her past catching up with her, and she agreed. 2 days later, they asked for her sword so they could repair it. The red and gold blade was a thing that she'd taken from a fallen soldier in one of the towns. It was magical, and she wasn't sure how well they could do with it, but the villagers insisted that they would have it repaired for her. Reluctantly, it passed from her hands to a nearby guard. She had no idea it would be the last time she got to hold her enchanted blade. Following another dinner party, she was exhausted. more so than usual, and she barely made it to bed before she fell into a deep sleep. The following day, she found her door locked. No amount of pounding on it seemed to draw any attention. The woman figured she could leave by the balcony, but found it enclosed with metal gates. She could hear people moving around outside the room. They were just ignoring her. They hadn't watched her too closely while trying to gain her trust, though. She had found a secret passage from her room, likely an old escape tunnel of one kind or another. She followed it to the gardens. There was a cloak and dress that one of the servants had left out to dry, a little large on her, but it covered her up well enough to tie around the waist and left her looking as poor as any other villager. The woman sped off towards the village. Everything seemed to be closed, and the guards were wandering the village at a higher rate than normal. Still, with no weapons, she decided to break into a nearby Fletcher's shop. While there, she managed to acquire a bow and arrows and a quiver. Eventually, she dug up a hunting knife, and then she heard the guards gathering a crowd towards the edge of the town square. She exited the building through the back before climbing onto the roof. The king's advisor was making an announcement. The curse would soon be lifted. Soon the healer would arrive and take away the girl from the village. They would all be able to die normally again within a few weeks. They only had to wait for their guests to arrive, and he was planning a warm welcome for them. It had been a long time since Aelin had used a bow. The elf slowly stood atop the building and took aim. She paused when she heard them announce that the king would be stepping up to speak. The woman knelt down a moment, hoping to not be noticed among the chimneys. Their king had begun a speech about their people and their plight. It seemed that even the humans couldn't stay dead, but their injuries remained. Many could not be healed by ordinary means. They were low on magical healing supplies, and even then, the cures were not reliable. It wasn't long before he began talking about her being the cause of their suffering, and that the arrangements were made to turn her over to the gods in exchange for a cure. Aelin leaned the quiver of arrows against the chimney and stood again, taking aim with a single arrow. She felt so betrayed in the moment, and that arrow was all she needed. Her intention was to send a message, nothing more. The sudden screams and frantic movements below made it hard to see if her aim was true. It had lodged through the mouth of the king and out his neck below. Despite the injury, he still appeared to be alive. It was difficult to see with his guards whisking him away. It didn't take long for them to figure out where the woman stood. All they could see was a cloaked stranger. She dropped the bow the second she hit the ground and drew the knife. She quickly cut through the guards before finding herself a new sword. This one was not enchanted, but a larger broadsword was still a comfort to her. She continued to fight, killing anyone who saw her face as she left. She had nearly escaped into the woods when a sudden pain flashed through her chest. The woman glanced down to see the tip of an arrow sticking up beneath her breast. She was struggling to breathe, but continued to run the best she could until she found a safe place she could stop again. A small outcropping of rock nearby had only a large enough space to hide in. She set her sword next to it and began closing it off the best she could with branches. Even so, she felt herself fading quickly. The arrow was keeping her from bleeding out, but her lung was definitely damaged. She needed a safe spot to rest. After she enclosed this area as much as possible, she reached for the arrow sticking out of her. The woman knew that this was going to be the worst part. With a great deal of effort, she managed to pull it through, feathers breaking off on her armor as the shaft tore past. Aelin started to cough, and then her breath fluttered. She could hardly breathe, but she managed to pull herself into the opening, dragging her blade and loosely covering the hole. Not as well as she would have liked, as she quickly lost consciousness. The girl would have never seen the energies that surrounded her body, but it kept away wandering wildlife as a surge of shadow and blood swarmed around her. When she woke again, blue hair fell into her eyes. She could barely move at first, but was happy that her memories had stayed this time. As soon as the woman stepped out of the opening, she stretched. Her clothing was still torn and stained, but her body had been restored to what it was before. The only change was that her hair was now blue. She could vaguely recall another time. Her eyes would be a mixture of purple and blue as well now. The young white-haired boy had awakened to his surroundings at the same time as her terrible dream, and was glancing around his location again. He was already starting to flood with memories of his past. They called him Arden, but he knew that was not his name. A whisper in his mind told him that he was born Asura, that he would find the meaning of the name later. Asura could clearly remember the battles and even part of his time in the demon realms. As the weeks went on, he became aware of how to make a weapon and how to train his body to fight. He wasn't strong enough, never strong enough. He began training every time there were no eyes on him. He was able to build a better dagger, though crude. Later, he built a second that was even better than the first. While working as a laborer had given him strength, practicing with sticks and tools continued to build his endurance and control. His body was already hardened from the beatings he had endured as a slave. He tended to not care much for interaction, and it usually led to troubles. As soon as he could use a sword, he began trying to find a way to either purchase or acquire one. He found out quickly that he could tell demons from humans in this town. Like the burning in his chest from the mark on his predecessor, this young man was already starting to sense them. A feeling in his gut, a burning in his chest, it varied, but it was never wrong. Any magical creature was enough to tip him off to its nature. He'd not known it, but the Lord who had purchased him often dragged his servants between the human and dark realms. During one of these trips, the boy managed to kill a demon attacking their caravans. He was awarded with the blade of that demon and moved to being a guard for the Lord from that point forward. As time flowed quite differently, Asura had a couple of decades to prepare himself in the short time it took Aelin to run into him. He felt his own name was too dangerous, so he always introduced himself as Wanderer or Arden, depending on the moment. Aelin found him at a pub, awaiting a chance to travel to the Dark Realms. At that time, she'd had little experience in some things, but she sensed something in him that she'd never found in any other. For a short time, they traveled together. She even enjoyed some of her few more intimate fantasies with this stranger. It was a little disheartening that he didn't seem to have an attachment back, but the woman was afraid of forming an attachment herself. She knew that, like any other, she would have to leave him behind someday. It was easier to accept his own sense of detachment when she thought that she could maintain one herself. Along their short time together, he had taken her to a place inside the edges of the Balance Realms. They'd fought an angel to return the city to the people. She burned too much energy maintaining a barrier to protect them from the outside. An injury the angel inflicted was going to kill her. She just didn't expect it to take effect so soon. He couldn't sense her when he checked on his companion. She didn't have a pulse. He was fairly certain she was dead, and carrying her body would make the next step of his journey take too long. Arden was trying to understand the sense of guilt flooding him. He'd traveled with others and not felt as he did in that moment. He was still half considering taking her body for a burial when one of the guards took it away. He couldn't be bothered with it. He needed to find Greed. But first, he needed to be powerful enough to assure no one else died in his presence. He left that land to travel across the realms of fire. By the time he left the region, he'd already killed many of their kind. He fought his way to the lands of Wrath. The Demon Lord answered very few of his questions. He gave him a challenge to kill a village of demons causing them trouble. In exchange, he could earn the chance to lift an impossible sword. If he could not lift it, he would be compensated with money rather than the weapon itself. Before the human left, Wrath told him that no one other than the human should be allowed to leave the village alive. The human took the trek across the lands, fighting and defeating any who stood in his way. All who faced him fell to the simple mortal sword that he'd held. When he arrived at the village, he found that there was a party being held. The demons had gathered most of the village together. Some were set to be tortured, others for far worse things. For a brief moment, Arden was reminded of the awakening. Seeing a group nearby that were changed and bound to what looked like altars was no help in the matter. He'd been told to let no one from this village live. A part of him momentarily considered saving the humans, but another part knew that he needed to do this job perfectly. His attack was through the middle of the would-be sacrifices. Ending them early would disrupt whatever the plans the demons here had in the works. After cutting through the middle of the mortals, he ended up face to face with a large demonic prince. The prince looked over Arden slowly and laughed. Wrath sends a mortal? He knew it. If anything, they expected Wrath to try to stop them, but sending a human seemed completely different than what they'd thought he would do. The human rested his blade a moment on his own shoulder, seeming all too casual, given what was standing in front of him. He sent death. It was all he had left to say. The human rushed the first demon, slicing his arm from him before rushing the second. A quick spin took the leg from the third. The entire village was 50 demons and nearly 100 humans that were being prepared for either sacrifice or to become hosts for more demons to enter the human world. Every single one of them would die to his blade. Many of the demons would never be reborn. The two kings were harder to fight, but the man managed to permanently destroy them as well. Even though he hadn't realized it at the time, the Lord of Wrath knew, and he found himself smiling back in his office. Maybe he had been wrong about the mortal. He would have to apologize for his own misunderstanding. The blade very well could have been right about him. Asura had returned badly injured, but still able to claim his reward. To his surprise, this demon lord chose to apologize for underestimating him. Wrath explained that if he was able to lift the sword, there was an armor that went with it. He could request the sword summon it for him, or even summon it directly once it bonded with him. When the man picked up the sword, he heard an all too familiar voice within his mind. Knowing the armor was able to appear with his will was something he felt might take some getting used to. The demon high king he had spoken to in the previous life had told him it would not allow him to die without his consent. The only exception was if the armor was removed before he healed, or a different specific scenario that was not meant to be shared with any other. This was exactly what he needed, but he was still not prepared to go after the demon lords themselves. Wrath sent him back through a portal to the human world to complete his training. He advised the mortal to do two things: find a way back on his own, and to learn who his true enemies and allies were. The human accepted the challenge. He did not feel ready. If the battle master of the 9 realms said he was not, he had to assume the immortal was correct. In the human realms, he began to collect bounties and fight beasts that had emerged during the time of the awakening. The rumors among demons and angels were clear. Each one encountered spoke of another awakening and the end of the mortal world. The man was determined to learn all he could, but first he needed to make these trails safer for his own kind. Clearing the beasts from the roads on his way to the city of Trist seemed like the best option. If he could find his way across the scorched lands, that is. If not, he would have to fight here, where the Order had the most power. These realms were mostly inhabited by a mixture of elvish and dwarven villages, with the occasional human settlements that they traded with. Arden had learned quite a lot from the dwarves, but the elves seemed to want very little to do with him. Then again, these days it was fairly common for people to hunt them for their blood. It had been said that the elf's blood can make a person unable to die. It was a little strange to him when some months later he ran into a caravan guard with similar gold markings on her face and skin to a woman he once knew. This one was a blue-haired elf with a strangely familiar presence. Aelin watched the man in curiosity as he tracked down the dire wolves she'd been hunting. They finally found them in the woods near the fallen remains of an old cabin. She'd sensed the one that was about to attack her, but she didn't expect the human to launch himself into battle and kill that one and the other two nearby. With his performance in eradicating all of the dire wolves, it was beyond easy to convince the caravan master to allow this new man to join them. Aelin verifying the stranger was human and his obvious skill were the first things the caravan master noticed. He was fully aware of what she was. He'd hired her himself. Having access to her magic was something he was hoping to never need. However, he needed as many swords as he could get. After all, their precious cargo needed as much protection as possible. They had come over the ice-capped mountains and moved to the far side. The woman was honestly surprised when this stranger, who called himself Arden, had asked her about their journey. When he asked her about the scorched lands, she was even more interested. If anything, it was odd for anyone to even consider going there. The fact is, they would be traveling very close to that region, if not across it. It depended where the new guard was meant to meet with them. The wagon and its cargo were meant to be passed off to another group. They were part of an exchange between kingdoms. With Arden's injuries, Aelin figured it wouldn't be too hard to convince him to travel with them to the city called Ember. There would be supplies there as well as healers. It was close to the edges of the deserts surrounding the scorched lands. She was a bit surprised when she mentioned her last name. Theris is the short form of an elvish name, but when she mentioned it was her surname, he had knowledge that the others around him seemed to be missing. She was also surprised that he knew of Arkite, and that he even made a comment that it was now isolated after an attempt on the king's life. She wondered if she had slipped up. While the Theris family were known among her people to be tied to the royal family, no one outside should have known that. For the most part, they were thought to be leads of the royal guard. He seemed pretty informed about a lot of things, though, including the elvish nature of her surname. Her elvish ears were normally hidden with a hood. She disliked others knowing what she was. Still, golden flame symbols marked the left half of her body. All that showed was flickers of gold where her skin broke through the armor, or the gold flames on the side of her face. The rest were covered by her clothing due to the cold, but the rapidly increasing heat would soon have her reduced to far less fabric. While traveling, a bit of small talk led to more introductions, but while they were speaking, the mortal said something that she was not expecting. I am the bone of my sword, the wrath of my will, bound by none, known by all. He knew that the words would reach her, but at first she seemed to ignore his comments. If anything, he could sense the blood in her wasn't as mortal as she seemed. Had he not been haunted by a strange familiarity, he probably would have removed her. With his injuries and the others nearby, he could wait. He didn't know enough of the story yet. Aylin's reply may have told him more than she realized, but the girl only spoke from her own heart and soul, as she always had. Some can never truly be bound by fate, by gods, by any other. She closed her eyes before turning to look at the human. Those eyes were half lilac and half blue, split down the middle like sunrise or sunset. After a pause, she whispered something more, though, something that felt a little odd to him. The blood in the crest. She paused. She wasn't even sure what it meant. She switched quickly to the demonic tongue, part of her wanting to keep talking, and she didn't want the others to understand. She didn't know if he would understand the following words: King with no throne, blood of the void, a star unknown. She wasn't even sure why she had said it. Something about those eyes hit him before the words. The words would have to register in his mind later. Arden easily understood the demon language. After all, in both this life and the last, he'd had many encounters with them, in and out of their own lands. To him, it was a confusing moment. He nearly never saw purple eyes, and the last time... No, he shook his head. After all, she'd been reborn somewhere. Maybe it was safer not to find her. Maybe even for the both of them. Yet the strange Demon King's words echoed in his mind. She wouldn't have the choice. This is why he wanted to end this, for his people, for himself, maybe even for her. But he couldn't be certain if that was selfish to think, especially as the sword had told him she was lacking her memories. Thus far, this new girl who insisted on speaking with him was not something the sword was willing to comment on at all. In fact, it seemed determined to remain silent, which almost bothered him more. Arden decided to bide his time. He fought with them along the course of their travel. The sun began to burn hotter, the travelers began shedding their winter clothing, and it wasn't long before he noticed something far more familiar about this girl. Exactly like the redhead who had sought him out earlier. She had golden flames, a birthmark, a tattoo. He was never sure, but they covered most of her left side. This was something he needed to get to the bottom of. At the moment, he decided to assume it might be a clan marking, as he didn't have enough information yet. Talking with the woman was a bit too familiar. He was fairly certain the two girls had too much in common, but he tried to convince himself it didn't matter. The human was distracted by something far more important. Arden had been curious about the cargo, but not enough to investigate it himself. It was when the caravan stopped that it started triggering an old memory. Contained within was a woman, surrounded by female guards and draped in a cloak and veil to hide her identity. A mission to transport a woman was always something political, which made this even more prone towards betrayal. He would have to be more cautious. The caravan made its way towards Ember, stopping at a nearby inn, where the men rested, relaxed, and the woman was escorted upstairs in the silence of the night. All too familiar. The caravan, the girl, the one he was talking with. She reminded him of a girl he had known not so long ago. In fact, as he watched her sitting across from him talking with the group that they had been traveling with, he realized she also had the exact same mannerisms as the redhead, and too many mannerisms of someone else he once knew as well. He stopped watching her and stared into the nearby fire. This was something he could sort out across the night. For now, he had a lot to think on before they traveled on again. From the sound of it, they would be staying for a couple of days. He hoped it would be enough time to piece this all together.